to this fourth of the five-part series. Um, and tonight we're going to look at Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil and its implication for kind of mental health and the world in which we are living at the moment. Um, I, I, I would like to just start off by kind of talking a little bit about um, what what I'm trying to do in this whole series, and in fact in my work in general at the moment. Um, and as some of you may recall, um, I'm writing a book on philosophy for psychotherapy, for psychologists and psychotherapists. Um, and the book is a kind of um, it's looking at key figures in the history of philosophy from a therapeutic perspective, rather than say from an analytic or even critical thinking perspective. Um, and so I'm working on about 12 different philosophers, ranging from Socrates through Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Hannah Arendt, of course. Um, and what the work is emerging as um, is it's emerging as a kind of phenomenological approach, um, or approach phenomenological reading of the history of a pattern within the history of philosophy. Um, and what I mean by phenomenology here, uh, and all my work is based in the end on Heidegger. Um, what I mean by phenomenology here is it's looking at the lived experiential conditions under which the thinking of particular thinkers emerged. So, for example, I'm looking at the kind of lived experiential conditions under which Socrates developed his way of thinking, um, and so on with the other philosophers as well. Um, and what it means to work with the lived experience of these philosophers um, is I'm kind of maintaining that that each of these philosophers begins their thinking in moods of disruption. So if we take Socrates as an example, um, there is in the context in which he began to philosophize, was a disruption to the kind of conventions of um, Greek, ancient Athenian society. So Athens at the time was at war with Sparta. There was the assumption that Athens would kind of kill off Sparta within 2 days. Um, a war tended to last 2 days, lasted 4 or 5 years. Um, and so there was a major disruption to those conventions that Athens had. And it was in this context that Socrates came to say things like, we cannot take the nature of virtue for granted. We need to rethink what we mean by virtue. Um, old concepts of virtue, old practices of virtue have become sterile, and they've lost their kind of for want of a better word now, authentic meaning. And so Socrates rekindled this question of virtue, of living a virtuous life. Um, and the mood of this questioning was perplexity. So uh, Socratic Socratic thinking, as I was taught it at university, begins with logic. It doesn't begin with mood. Um, and It's clear that perplexity is a mood. It's not just a technique. To be perplexed is to be bewildered, it's to be puzzled. It's to kind of have the sense of not knowing how to go on, and yet also being curious at the same time. Um, and so this was the mood for Socrates, the mood in which the question of virtue became a live question again, because he believed that Athenians weren't, they were talking about virtue, but they weren't really living a virtuous life, so to speak. And if we take other philosophers, just taking Descartes as an example, Descartes' philosophy also emerged in moods of disruption. And the particular disruption for Descartes was a sense that the, the, um, the kind of assumptions of education in which he had grown up was a kind of theological or theocratic set of conventions, the belief that, a God-given world holds the world together, a belief in a kind of that there are truths that are developed on the basis of education. And in his early 20s, Descartes found himself in a kind of disruption, kind of triggered by his embracing of sciences, and where he came to say something like, the sciences have kind of led me to see that I cannot take the assumptions of my education for granted. In fact, he went further than that and said, I cannot take any assumptions for granted. He posed a question like, in the past, I've taken assumptions for granted. How do I know in the future that the assumptions that are being built up around science cannot be taken for granted? In other words, there was a kind of radical doubt around the conventions of his world. Um, and in his work, both in his kind of letters and even in his philosophical work, he speaks about anxiety-like experiences of not being able to hold on to anything. And so again, here we see a mood of disruption as the kind of contextual trigger giving rise to Descartes' thinking. And so that process with about 12 philosophers is kind of, there's a mood of disruption, the disruption of conventions. And in that mood of disruption of conventions emerges a way of thinking that is kind of addressing the disruptions. Um, and so Heidegger, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Sartre, all these kind of Hegel, all these philosophers begin in response to some kind of mood of disruption. Um, and this for me is where the therapeutic dimension of philosophy starts to come in. Um, because if you look at it as moods of disruption, and if you take moods of disruption therapeutically, um, the process of philosophy in these philosophers was kind of less about arriving at an epistemological kind of notion of truth. It wasn't kind of a scientific notion of truth. It wasn't a kind of theoretical notion of truth. It's much more, to use a Heideggerian word, it's much more about disclosing a new world. So, kind of the claim I'm making is that each of these philosophers disclosed a new vocabulary, if you like. Each of them disclosed a new horizon in which thinking occurred. So with Socrates, it's the language of virtue. With Descartes, it's the language of kind of analytical thinking and kind of mind and body and the subject and the object, which lies behind Descartes' thinking. Um, and so each of the thinkers gives rise to a new way of kind of seeing, and even more than seeing, being in the world. You know, being in the world as a subject is very different from being in the world as, say, a kind of sinner from Christianity. You know, being a sinner is a way of being in the world, and being objective and subjective is a different way of being in the world. Um, so, so the therapeutic dimension is it's a response to moods. It's a way of kind of working through and thinking through moods, um, and using it in a very general and loose sense. It offers a kind of insight, a different kind of insight into ways of being in the world. Um, and I must say I'm quite excited at this project and how it's emerging. However, what I'm not really excited about is my kind of style of presentation and my kind of style of being with, in gatherings like this. I think that my style of writing, wanting to start off with the moods rather than with the concepts of the philosophers, it's kind of thrown me off kilter quite a bit in my presentations, and I don't even know if presentations is the right word, to describe what it is that we're doing together. Um, and so I'm not 100% sure what we're doing together. Um, and I would like us to be able to kind of stay in that space and kind of play in the space of kind of not knowing what is in fact in some ways going on between us. Um, and of course, this is a disruption, you know. So it's kind of, let's say it's a reflexive disruption. We're not only thinking about disruption, we're also thinking from within the mood of disruption at the same time. So let's say we're doing two kinds of things at once. On the one hand, we're looking at the philosophy of Hannah Arendt tonight. On the other hand, we're looking at a kind of process of engagement, uh, which is not strictly presentations, but it's also not strictly workshopish. So it's kind of somewhere between, or it's discovering itself, I guess, as we go along. So I would invite your responses on both levels, I guess, on the kind of process level and the content level of what we're doing. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Hannah Arendt. Um, and I'm going to hopefully do a kind of reading of Hannah Arendt that is approximates the writing process that I've been developing. And so, in that sense, the writing process is about starting with the lived experience of Hannah Arendt, um, and how her philosophy, and how her philosophizing, because I don't think she had a philosophy. I think it was an ongoing practice of philosophizing. And I think that's one of the great things about Hannah Arendt, is that she never settles on her own views. She always is able to question her own views. Um, and in that sense, not building a kind of edifice of a systems of philosophy, like let's say Descartes does, but it's kind of uh, part of her thinking process is about kind of allowing herself to kind of revise her thinking as she's undergoing her thinking. So I would like to start with the lived experience um, of Hannah Arendt, and from there move into uh, her philosophizing as a response to lived experience. Um, so what I've done is I've taken some of her poetry um, and extracted some lines from her poetry um, that conveys a sense of her mood. Um, and what I hope there is we can look at these lines from her and then begin to open her philosophy on the basis of her the mood of her poetry. So I'm just going to read a few lines of her poetry to you, and then let's move from there. So, in a poem in about in the early 1940s, in fact, both poems I've taken from there. She says, I know that the houses have fallen. We entered the world in them, wonderfully sure that we were sturdier than, wonderfully sure that they were sturdier than we. I'll just read it again. I know that the houses have fallen. We entered the world in them, wonderfully sure that they were sturdier than we. So I find her words incredibly moving here. Um, and what I find incredibly moving about this is um, she kind of starts with a taken for granted sense. We entered the world in them, wonderfully sure that they were sturdier than we. So we can even say more than wonderfully sure that they were sturdier. We can say that she didn't even have to say that kind of statement. The house is so taken for granted that it doesn't need to be said. It's kind of in the background. It's not in the foreground. It's only when the kind of houses are disrupted that this comes to life. And so the first line there was, I know that the houses have fallen. So I guess we've got to say that this is Hannah Arendt in the kind of build-up to National Socialism in Germany, and that she had grown up in Germany as a citizen of Germany, with the taken for granted sense that Germany was her home. and suddenly she's kind of confronted with the disruption of her home. Um, and she cannot take that sense of being home for granted. Um, and so she kind of is in a space of kind of homelessness. Um, and here I'll just read another part of a poem. I stand in no country. I'm neither here nor there. I'm not certain of anything. Okay, so we see kind of a whole mood of disruption beginning to emerge, uh, taking the notion of home for granted, national socialism as disrupting the sense of home, the kind of shock of experiencing that she has no sense of home. I'm not certain of anything. So she has no foundation upon which to stand. Her foundations have kind of been swept from under her feet. Um, and even to the extent, this is actually an earlier poem, not a later poem, but it kind of brings the message home. Um, the sense of disruption, the deep sense of disruption in which she lives is, she says, when I consider my hand a foreign thing related to me. Okay, so her hand confronts her um, as kind of estranged, as she's kind of almost dissociated uh, from her own hand. She's kind of disembodied from her own hand. And so with these, we get a very, very powerful mood of disruption. Um, And in very broad terms, we can say that Hannah Arendt's thinking, her political thinking, and her philosophical thinking, if there's a distinction between the two, was a response to the sense of homelessness in which she lived. Um, she was uh, much of her work was concerned not with the personal home, but with the political home. Um, and she was a lot of her writing was focused around kind of the breakdowns of the political home. So her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, um, was a kind of, well, it was a philosophical reflection on the kind of conditions which give rise to kind of totalitarian thinking. And I think not only in Germany, but more generally in the world. Um, and so she kind of starts to look at things like, how, um, for example, we rendered speechless or we feel silent in the face of uh, tyrants. Um, but this very silence also brings the tyrants on. It kind of provides fuel for the space of tyrants to emerge. So she's very much looking at kind of, the conditions which allow fascism and so on to emerge. Um, and it's this theme that I would like to pick up on in a later work of hers, The Banality of Evil, where she's again looking at similar themes to the origins of totalitarianism. She's looking at evil. She's looking at radical evil in this work. And so we see her thinking as a response to the kind of conditions, the mood-based or emotional conditions of existence, of being an outcast. And I think one of the themes that comes up strongly in the Origins of Totalitarianism, um, is what she calls the right to have rights. And she says kind of the homeless, the refugees, um, have kind of do not have the right to have rights. And what she means by the right to have rights is rights for her are occur within homelands, um, and to have lost the right to have a right is to have lost the homeland. And so I think it's also important perhaps to note here that she's not thinking within a liberal, rational context of rights. Much more, she's closer to an existential notion of rights. Rights are the homeland in which you have the right to have rights. And so she's thinking in this space. She's moving on in the space. Um, and so what will be interesting, I think, is the way in which her thinking in the banality of evil uh, moves away, or sorry, not moves away, questions her own thinking in the origins of totalitarianism. So let's move towards that position rather than starting with it. Okay, so now I hope that what I've done so far is build the kind of mood of lived experience uh, through which Hannah Arendt philosophizes. This homelessness, the foundations being taken away. The mood of that is the mood of her philosophizing. Um, so philosophizing for her is not just an academic activity of being, in fact, she kind of rallies against Heidegger. She says Heidegger is a professional philosopher, and she's not a professional philosopher. She's not kind of sitting, I mean, she was in the New School of Social Research, but her primary focus was on kind of existence, not on kind of epistemology or representational notions of truth. So philosophy is, we could say, a kind of, it was urgent, it was ultimate. It wasn't just detached, stepping back. So let's move into her thinking now. Um, and I would like to move into her thinking in the context of the banality of evil um, by um, posing the question that she was raising. Uh, uh, Posing the question that actually astounded her in the banality of evil. And the question that the thing that astounded her, that astonished her in the book, The Banality of Evil, um, was the kind of idea that she expected. So the banality of evil, maybe to give a little context, assuming that people don't have the context. The Banality of Evil was a book she wrote in response to the trial of Eichmann in 1961 in Jerusalem. Um, Hannah Arendt was asked by one of the magazines or papers in New York to go and observe the proceedings in Jerusalem and to write up a column for the paper. And that was her intention. Her intention was to go and write up a paper for the magazine. Um, not to question herself or anything like that, just to do a bit of kind of academic journalism, I suppose one could call it. Um, and she went in with the assumption, uh, coming out of the work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, with the assumption that she was going to see radical evil, that she was going to see demonic evil. Um, and whilst she was kind of observing and witnessing the processing during the trial, it kind of suddenly came over her and shocked her that this man, Eichmann, who she expected to be the embodiment of radical evil, actually was a very ordinary, everyday kind of person. That his ambitions were average, everyday kind of ambitions, that his thinking was no different from an average, everyday way of thinking of anyone, really. That his aspirations were uh, that his aspirations were um, kind of, in many ways, very middle class aspirations. He wanted to be very successful in his work. He wanted to have high positions of authority. He was kind of climbing, you know, the corporate ladder or the kind of political ladder. Um, and his relationship to kind of National Socialism, uh, he was committed to it. He was committed to the ideology of National Socialism. Um, and on this point, Hannah Arendt says that it was precisely his commitment to the ideology of National Socialism that prevented him from seeing or experiencing what he was actually doing. He believed, so can I say, his mood or his existential framework was that he was developing plans, he was developing strategies, he was developing goals, he was doing everything so-called good managers do. Strategic thinking, planning, executing, controlling, leading, all those kinds of things. Uh, and it was in that framework that he was aspirational. Um, and we could say objectively, he knew that he was building extermination camps because that was his portfolio. He was responsible for the final solution in Nazi Germany. So he was building the concentration camps. Um, and objectively speaking, he knew this. Um, but it wasn't kind of on his um, existential horizon, if you like. It wasn't on his subjective horizon. Um, and he even went to concentration camps. So it's not as though he didn't have a first-hand experience of a concentration camp. So he went there. But even then, he still didn't know existentially what he was doing. Um, and for Hannah Arendt, um, you know, this was kind of, it bowled her over that here was a man that had just very ordinary, everyday, middle class ambitions. His kind of ideology, his National Socialist ideology precluded him, sorry, got in the way. I don't know if that's the right expression, but his National Socialist ideology got in the way of his actually experiencing what he was doing. So what Hannah Arendt says, the way she puts this, is to say that once you have an ideology, it kind of um, it, it desensitizes you to the other. You know, once you have an ideology, it can it desensitizes you to the other. You don't see the otherness of the other. You know, you don't see the vulnerability of the other. You don't see the humanness of the other. The other becomes a thing, um, and the other becomes a thing that you can manipulate, and you can do this or that with, you know. Um, and so what she came to see was that Eichmann, embedded in his ideology, like any other kind of ideology, didn't see and didn't want to see the humanness, the vulnerability of the other. Um, so, in an existential sense, and I am speaking generally, but in an existential sense, the person of the other didn't exist. The humanness of the other didn't exist for Eichmann. Um, and so Hannah Arendt, this was a shock to Hannah Arendt because she did not expect to see a kind of everyday man with everyday ambitions, ideologies, prejudices. She expected to see demonic evil in front of her. Um, and so what we begin to see here also um, is Hannah Arendt at this point is curious from within this contradiction. She comes out of the origin of totalitarianism saying that evil is demonic. And this is what she expects to find um, at the trial in Jerusalem. But she didn't find this. And she didn't push it aside. She didn't try and force Eichmann into her old paradigm or her old way of thinking. She stayed with the contradiction. She was excited about the contradiction. And she allowed herself to think through the contradiction. And this thinking through the contradiction is really the book, The Banality of Evil, because the kind of what I've called the everyday, she's calling the banal. The banality of evil is the average everyday mentality of this kind of man, Eichmann, and his evil is banal. She's not saying that it's not evil. The evil is radical. She's not in any way disputing that, but she's saying it's done by a man who's banal. It's done by a man who's not thinking, who's not, who's, and we'll open that one up a bit more as we go along. It's done by a man who's not kind of thinking. Um, he's in this average everyday mode, just to use that Heideggerian expression. He's living in this average everydayness, and you know, in an average everyday mode, sensitivity to existence is blocked off from one. And so she follows her train of thought here. And she follows it in the face of opposition from so many of those around her. Because Hannah Arendt was Jewish, and she was in Israel doing this. And her kind of Israeli colleagues were saying to her things like, you're being a traitor. Um, and, some of her friends refused to associate with her anymore once she took up this kind of theme of the banality of evil. But she stayed with it and she worked through it. Um, and so this is what we are looking at. So, I would like to emphasize then that again that Hannah Arendt's thinking is a thinking that's underway. Um, it's not a thinking that's concluded. It's a thinking that's underway. And of course, there's strong Heideggerian tones to that. That thinking takes place in the space and underway, you know. Um, so, and in this underwayness, or this underwaying, I don't know the right term, but in this kind of dynamic process of being underway, um, what she comes to is a kind of conclusion or a theme that can sound itself quite banal. Um, and what she begins to see in Eichmann is that he was thoughtless, that this was actually thoughtlessness. It wasn't anything else. It was thoughtlessness. Um, he he whatever lacked, I don't know, refused the ability to think. Um, and so I think that this is quite important as well, that here it's thoughtless. And people would say, no, Achman's a psychopath. Um, and Arendt would say, no, this is not psychopathology. This is thoughtlessness. He's not a psychopath. He has average everyday ambitions. He has an average everyday family. He has cultural aspirations. He's not kind of a mental disorder, whatever that means. The primary thing is not thinking. Um, and I must say, I'm very curious about this as well, because do we, well, do I ever stop to think that thinking itself is the problem? We tend, in an everyday way, we tend to think about thinking as the basis for solving problems. Or we tend to think about thinking as the way of kind of working through things. But Hannah Arendt saying something like quite fundamental here that I'm not putting it in her terms now, I'm putting it in my terms. This is a disorder of thinking, or in her terms, well, she wouldn't use the word disorder, and I guess I wouldn't either, really. But it's a kind of, there's something wrong. There's something that's got very messed up here about thinking, you know. And so what Hannah Arendt says is that in our thinking, we take the question of thinking for granted. We 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 might have rules for thinking. We might think about thinking. Let's say logic is a way of thinking about thinking. And we have rules for critical thinking, and so on. Um, but staying in the presence of thinking and not thinking is something that I think Hannah Arendt is kind of raising for us. The power of thinking to affect our reality, to affect our world. Um, and so kind of what comes up with Hannah Arendt um, is this kind of notion that, underlying Eichmann was that he wasn't thinking, he was thoughtless. I mean, she does use the word thoughtless to describe him. He was thoughtless, and that was his primary issue. Um, so, which again, and maybe I'm just a bit stuck on it at the moment, but again, it's this kind of that we so take for granted the notion of thinking. We tend to think that evil or whatever evil means, or disorders or whatever they mean, is a product of kind of, I mean, is a product of kind of the unconsciousness, or is a product of kind of personality stuff, or irrational thinking, or kind of a disordered will, or something like that. And she's saying no, that underlying all those kind of, psychologizing is this kind of not thinking that's going on. Um, and she kind of invites us, I think, um, to be in the space of being perplexed by not thinking, you know, that we so assume that we're thinking, but are we thinking, even as we are here tonight, is what we're doing called thinking, what would allow it to be called thinking? I'm doing a presentation at the moment, is a presentation thinking? What is thinking, between us, you know? And so, uh, you know, when we're in kind of workshops, are we thinking, when we're learning our theories, are we actually thinking when we're kind of learning our theories? And again, whether it be existential or any other kind of conceptual framework, are we in the mood of thinking when we are engaged in theorizing or learning theories, um, or even kind of in supervision, are we in the mood of thinking? And I think that phrase is crucial to all of this. And I'd like to say that's a Heideggerian kind of phrase. It's not something that Hannah Arendt explicitly develops, but it's kind of definitely there in her work, that the mood of thought, rather than just the kind of detached, analytic, uh, disengaged, rational conceptualization. It's kind of how do you be with the mood of thought? How do you stay within the mood of thinking? Um, and so again, we come to this kind of, I mean, I hope kind of what's emerging here is actually a sense of the power of thought, that thinking is not something that is just neutral. And I guess I think many of us have kind of grown up to believe that thinking is neutral, it's objective, that when we're using our theories, we're standing at a disengaged distance and observing things as they really are, kind of speak, and that scientific rationality. And here we come in know thinking itself is moodful. And again, I'll just say, that's Socrates, perplexity in Socrates. That's the mood of thinking there. In Aristotle, the mood of thinking was wonder, you know. Um, and I guess here, the broader point I'm making is that when we do philosophy or when we learn theories, unfortunately, that sense of the mood of thinking has been kind of taken out of our theorizing or philosophizing. Um, so, um, so Hannah Arendt is kind of the banality of evil, just to say it again, is that this man doing evil but not thinking, that the problem here is not thinking. And even as I say it now to myself, is coming up the idea, but how can this be not thinking? You know, he saw the concentration camps. He was there. Uh, he was doing all the planning for the concentration camps. And Hannah Arendt saying he was not thinking. So how is this possible? So I just want to leave that question hanging over us as we go forward. Um, and I'd like to read, I've given it to you in the handout that I gave you, but it's just a kind of, I haven't been able to trace the source of this, but it's a survivor of a concentration camp. And it kind of it alludes quite strongly to the kind of thinking that Hannah Arendt's doing. So I'll read it to you, and then we can kind of unpack it a little bit in the kind of attunement of Hannah Arendt. Uh, so the person says, "Dear teacher, uh, I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more humane." So I think this says a lot of things, but I guess one of the things it says in our context, and we can play with this as well, is that an education revolving around reading, writing, and arithmetic, the three R's, um, produces a kind of insensitivity to the human dimension of being. And even to have to say the human dimension of being sounds quite weird, but in a sense, that's what she's saying, and that's what Hannah Arendt is saying as well, that certain practices of thinking desensitize us to the human dimension of being. Um, and I guess not only in others, but even in ourselves as well. Um, so, um, Hannah Arendt's thinking here, and sorry for repeating myself, it's just part of my style. Um, uh, Hannah Arendt's thinking here is, it's thinking that's kind of got in the way of our attunement to the human dimension of being. Or sorry, it's the absence of thinking. It's thoughtlessness. that's got in our way of being attuned to the human, the vulnerability, the kind of aspirational um, sides of what it means to be human. And Eichmann is not thinking like a human. Um, but if we follow this logic of the poem, of this kind of request, so much of our education has taken us away from the attunement to the human dimension of being. We prepared for reading, writing, and arithmetic, but we're not attuned with I don't know, a sensitivity to vulnerability. I guess even getting it wrong. I mean, I just remember as a child getting it wrong in a class. You were shut down. There was no space to get it wrong. And I think many of us carry that over as we grow older as well. You shut down for, so you can't even be sensitive to yourself, to what's emerging in you. Um, so 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 let's try and take this a step further in Hannah Arendt's work, and I would like to um, work with a distinction that Heidegger actually brings out, and which is present in Arendt's work, and which was very present in the relationship between Arendt and Heidegger. They used to spend many hours speaking about thinking and not thinking, but in a mood of thinking about not thinking, not just in a kind of abstract, rational way. And the distinction that Heidegger makes is a distinction between, let's call it meditative thinking and calculative thinking. And meditative thinking is kind of allowing thinking to occur. It's a kind of pondering. It's kind of a poetic kind of thinking, very much like those lines from Hannah Arendt that I quoted earlier. Pondering is allowing thinking to occur. It's not trying to seize on thinking. It's like Hannah Arendt in the trial of Eichmann. She didn't try and kind of force the thinking out. She didn't try and force it into her old paradigm. She stayed with what was emerging. She stayed with the kind of excitement and curiosity of what was emerging as she was sitting in this trial and having her previous assumptions about evil totally disrupted. And she allowed that disruption to emerge. She allowed thinking to emerge in that disruption. Calculative thinking, on the other hand, um, is that kind of thinking which well calculates. It's all about kind of finding the right means to achieve pre-given ends, but the ends themselves are not questioned existentially. They can be debated rationally, but not existentially. So calculative thinking is kind of calculative thinking. Well, it's thinking like a computer. Um, and I think I might be wrong on this, but AI would fall into calculative thinking. Um, it's kind of thinking that can be produced in a kind of method or an algorithm, or you just have to follow the method, you know. So in management schools, I don't know, you have to follow the kind of 7 rules of this or that, you know. Um, and so you'll calculate, everything will be reduced to what can be calculated. Um, and if it cannot be calculated, and I think this is a bigger point for Arendt, if it cannot be calculated, it's discarded as kind of meaningless or empty. Um, and for kind of those who've kind of worked in business schools, I mean, that very strong division between what they call the hard skills and the soft skills. Um, and if you can't put your soft skills into a calculative format, then they're kind of deemed to be meaningless. And I guess in kind of psychology and therapy, um, my belief is like evidence-based therapy would be the attempt to reduce therapy to a kind of calculative kind of framework, you know. Um, so calculative thinking is reductive, as we've said, you know. Um, it's analytical. It's about narrowing things down. Well, it's about drawing things to the kind of analytical bases. Um, and so Hannah Arendt and Heidegger are saying that this has kind of become the dominant form of thinking in the Western world, this kind of calculative thinking. Um, so uh, that's the next step that Hannah Arendt takes, is kind of thinking is like more like a meditative process. Um, she kind of calls it um I think a two-in-one. It's the kind of dialogue that one has with oneself, you know, the dialogue that kind of emerges out of oneself. What's emerging out of me? You know, what's the thinking that's emerging out of me? Um, and what she's saying is that that kind of meditative thinking or kind of reflexive thinking um, is that kind of thinking is very sensitive to the human situation, to the human condition. Whereas the calculative thinking um, kind of imposes itself on the human situation, so it doesn't see the human behind it. Um, so, um, so we have these two kinds of thinking: the meditative thinking, uh, which is allowing kind of being to emerge, if you like, or allowing thinking to emerge, and following, listening to it, listening to the thinking that's emerging, rather than a forceful kind of thinking. Um, and I'm sure in your therapies, I mean, what I often get are clients that say, okay, so let's see, so I feel inadequate or something like that, you know. So, and then the next question comes, so what do I do about this? You know, how do I go about finding a solution for this? Um, uh, yes, I don't have much self-worth. Okay, I don't have much, but even that register of talking is out of it already. I don't have much self-worth, but what do I do about it? You know, so there's kind of no sensitivity there to their own humanity in that situation. Um, so um, what we're unpacking is this meditative kind of thinking more and more. I think we're dominated by the calculative, and we're kind of moving towards going beyond that calculative way of thinking. Um, and for so here I've got to say I'm reframing Hannah Arendt in my terms. Um, Again, I said earlier, she doesn't speak about the notion of a mood of thinking. Um, but the notion of a mood of thinking is implicit in her work. Um, and the example that I've given, and I'll give again, is her own lived experience at the trial of Eichmann, that she didn't try and force her thinking, she didn't try and force Eichmann into her box. She was excited at the space of being disrupted, at her own conventions being disrupted. So she was excited. That excitement is a mood of thinking. The curiosity to think against herself uh, was exciting for her. Um, but again, it needs to be said that this kind of thinking against herself was not just a logical thinking against herself. You know, she wasn't like a lawyer trying to find the kind of limitations to her argument or what the opponent would say. You know, she was much more in the space of kind of fascination with it. Um, so it was being in this mood of excitement that she was in this, again, she calls it a two-in-one process. The voices in ourselves, you know, and she was thinking in these voices within herself, the dialogue, the inner dialogue with herself, in response to her disruption of Eichmann. Another occasion on which she did this, which has kind of been alluded to a little bit, but not brought out quite explicitly. Um, um, as I've said, Hannah Arendt was Jewish, and she was Jewish in the context of being kind of expelled from, not expelled. I mean, she was lucky to get out. Um, she was lucky to get out, uh, but she was traumatized. Her sense of homelessness was kind of radical. It wasn't just, a physical home; it was an existential home. Um, and in the space of loss of existential home, unlike, let's say, Jewish nationalists went for the establishment of a Jewish state. Okay? Nationalism is the kind of uh, whether it's Jewish or other nationalisms makes no difference. Nationalism in general has a kind of structure that the way in which we deal with our wounds and our anxieties is by kind of creating a nation state in which we kind of wall ourselves in. And what we aim for is to create security for ourselves, um, whether it's kind of Jewish nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism. I think the reemergence of nationalism in Europe in so many ways, Donald Trump nationalism, Make America Great Again, um, um, the way in which kind of wounds and vulnerabilities and anxieties are dealt with is by insulating ourselves in a nation state. And Hannah Arendt said to this in the context of Jewish nationalism, she said, no. She said, we are here repeating the very problem that we want to get away from. The problem is not simply that it was German. The problem is that it was nationalism. And nationalism insulates us and it otherizes. It demonizes the other. It dehumanizes the other. It takes the other uh, out of the realm of being human. Um, and so for Hannah Arendt, um, this kind of demonizing of the other sets a chain reaction, which then resurfaces as another kind of nationalism. So we have kind of the wounds of the Palestinian people, um, and we have kind of um, the wounds wanting to, in one version, come into one kind of nationalism, on another version, to hold open the space and not kind of go into a narrow-minded kind of nationalism. So Hannah Arendt here is not succumbing to the wounds. She's not succumbing to the threats. Uh, and she is threatened. She is traumatized. She is a Jew in exile. She's kind of feels the pain of exile. But she doesn't become reactive in exile. She doesn't go for a kind of narrow-minded nationalism. She opens. She's kind of reflective in that very space of being wounded. In other words, for her, the wound is transformed into an opportunity for thinking, for reflection. And again, this is in Heidegger meditative kinds of thinking. And for Arendt, this is kind of reflexive thinking of the wound, staying with the wound opens up the possibility for a thinking that goes beyond a narrow-minded nationalism.